Okay, here we go with the first lecture of 300, the Frank Miller, Lynn Varley large widescreen comic, as they're called, widescreen comics. This is the thing back in the early aughties when people were trying to reinvent comics again. And Frank Miller is a famous, probably one of the most famous American comic book artists. And Lynn Varley is a painter who, in this case, has done the painting. So Miller produces the artwork, what is called the line art, and he produces black and white images. And then everything else is Lynn Varley's painting. So if you look at one of these pages and you imagine it just in black and white, which we'll talk about because there are no grays, everything else is Lynn Varley. So it's a real piece of work here to have. They sometimes talk about people who do this job in comics as colorists, but really they're painters. And anyway, okay, so this book came out in the late '90s, and then Zack Snyder made his horrific film of the same name. And then they made a sequel to it. I guess they decided they couldn't stop the franchise, and the sequel was even worse than the first one. And they tried to give it some PC component and get a bigger market share by having Eva Green come in as one of the evil, whatever. Okay. This functions as a piece of out and out propaganda, and what's interesting about it is that Miller wrote it just before all the wars were about to happen. So it's very unfortunate for the rest of us who basically don't don't believe this is a good idea, any of this war crap. That here is this book, which was ripe for the making by a hack like Zack Snyder. He's just so mean-minded and maybe the only thing so far that I've seen him do that was, I think, wholly his, that he wasn't trashing somebody else's property by putting his greasy hands all over it, was Sucker Punch, which was, it had all the sort of misogyny and usual stuff that he has in it, but it was more overtly him, and it was more honestly, honest is not a good word for Zack Snyder. Anyway, whatever. Okay, so you'll see this this calligraphy, and then I have put in my public service announcement, which is, this is what I number as page 1. So when I give you page numbers, I'm numbering from this page. So this is page 1, and then everything after that. So it's 1. Okay. All right. And then I am organizing this talk into 6 different parts, which you'll see here. And the last of which is synecdoche, which is how you pronounce that. Which is a form. It's a Greek form of language, basically. Most of the forms of language that we have that are like a metaphor, those sorts of ideas, come from, in the West, come from the Western tradition of interpreting or reading and interpreting literature, which means Greek and Roman. So it's either in Greek or it's in Latin or Italian, early Italian, Latin. It's in Latin. Okay. Okay, here were the first 5 covers, because this first appeared as a series of comics, and then it was remade by Miller into this widescreen format. And this really was a very interesting attempt by Miller to remake comics and to get away from what are often called the pamphlets, the floppies, the little books, basically the sort of a 32-page stapled booklet, which we call a comic book. Okay, so this is yeah, and you can see the different chapters. And basically, he's going to use these as the chapters. Okay. So what do you sort of when you're looking at a thing like this? And so this, I'm going to just talk about the visual, the way that this is organized visually, because there's a huge amount of information compressed into this thing, and that's because comics has its own language. And so what I want to do here is talk about the language of comics just for a little bit. Yeah. Okay. So partly the language. So, but what are you going to do if you don't know comics? What if you're just reading comics, which is great. That's terrific. You're just reading comics. Great. I love it. It's sort of like just reading a novel. It's like, oh, are you reading it for pleasure? Oh no. It's like read a novel for pleasure. Absolutely. The idea, you don't need to have an English degree to read a novel. That's the point about novels. That's why they were considered to be such trash when they first came out in the 18th century. People were like, what is this garbage? You should be reading the Greeks. That's what you should be reading. Yeah. And not popular culture like Erasmus and Shakespeare, that trash, that hack. Yeah, Shakespeare, the Zack Snyder of his day. So the tributes, basically, when I'm talking about tribute here, I'm talking about what other graphic styles and graphic languages does Miller use? Because he uses a bunch, and so it can be helpful to know them. And that's why you have somebody like me pointing them out and saying, see, because people will say, oh, but I didn't know. It's like, you do now. So the first one you'll see is on the opening page here, called Tributes, which is Lone Wolf and Cub. And Lone Wolf and Cub is an amazing 28 book. There are 28 tankobon in this series. It's a very famous manga. It's one of the most famous manga. It's Chanbara, which means it's a samurai epic, basically. And the story concerns Ito Ogami, who is the shogun's assassin. He's the shogun's executioner. So he executes the shogun. Says, okay, that's it. This person, and very few people get to be killed by the shogun. It's such a great honor. Okay, it's a very different culture. It's like, oh, the person who kills you does you a great honor. And the West has something like that. I mean, but anyway. So here we see Ogami, Ito, and his son Daigoro, and Ogami's wife and Daigoro's mother has been killed in an attempt to overturn the Ogami line, and he's after vengeance. So visually, this is one of the great influences on Miller, who had read these manga in Japanese before they were translated, and that's how a lot of manga initially in the, say, 70s just wasn't translated. So if you wanted to read it, you had to just go and look at it and do your best to sort of follow it, if you didn't speak Japanese, as I didn't and don't. Okay, so we're in the world of Japan, or in the East, and this is something where Miller takes a great deal of his design sense from the East, specifically from Japan, because Japan is what Roland Barthes, the same Roland Barthes who wrote mythologies, and you probably heard about Barthes in 20. I hope you will have run into Roland Barthes. If not, he's a very interesting. He's a very fine writer and a very fascinating thinker, an amazing. Yeah. He also was a semiotician, which is people who basically try to figure out what does a sign mean, and so you're not just using linguistic systems, but all visual systems. Semiotics is very useful for everything, not just for, say, a printed text. It's also good for film. It's good for opera. It's good for comics. It's good for any advertising. It doesn't matter. music, you name it. Okay, so here we have Leonidas and his Spartans, who all have these wool cloaks on, right? They have these red wool cloaks, and that's all they've got. Plus their breech clout, their underwear, and their sandals, and they are observing the waves, which will cause a miracle for them, because it's going to cause the Persian army, the Persian navy, to founder. That is, most of the ships will go down because they're not deep keeled enough, and etc. So they just get knocked over in these kinds of waves. And so there's this. He gives over a whole page 27, to these incredible waves. And the thing about Miller is that he has a wonderful sense of design, but the images are often very static. There's not a lot of motion in them. And the ironic thing is that he's almost always drawing action. So you'll see this in Sin City, and you'll see it in Dark Knight, and you'll see it in just about everything he does, especially in the most recent Dark Knights, where he has characters sort of posing, and it's like, are they moving, or are they just sort of, they look solid? And so he sort of draws the ocean the same way. Well, why? It's like, well, because he's specifically making reference to the Great Wave off Kanagawa, which is this next piece. And this is one of the most famous, if not the most famous, I suppose, in the West, recognizable images of a Japanese woodblock print. These are famous in the 18th to the 19th centuries, when the Japanese really became masters of this form. And this one is by Hokusai, and Hokusai did, and now I'm trying to remember the number, I think it's 32 views of Mount Fuji. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I even have a book of this. Oh, they're beautiful. They're all gorgeous. And somewhere off in the distance, there's Mount Fuji. Now, Mount Fuji represents a ritual important place for the Japanese. And so Hokusai basically, it's like he's going around the mountain, both psychologically and graphically, spiritually, taking views essentially of the country, where Mount Fuji is at the center of the view. So you'll see way in the distance what looks like a wave is actually Mount Fuji. There it is. And meanwhile, we see these fishermen who are out there in these amazing fishing going boats, which are all handmade, and it's amazing stuff. And they go out into these rough seas for centuries. They went out to these rough seas just off the coasts of the home islands in Japan. And so this is known as the Great Wave off of Kanagawa. So it is sort of a testament to the force of nature, and that's what Miller is after here, right? So when we put these two things together, you're like, oh yeah, I see that this is actually a reference to that. So this page 27 is about the force of nature. And there's a difference here, because in the Hokusai original, it's the force of nature, but these intrepid fishermen are out there fishing, right? Despite the great waves off Kanagawa. But in the case of the Spartans, they're observing that the ocean has brought defeat to their enemies in this part, and this will allow them to go ahead and fight in Thermopylae. Okay. We then get, one of the things you can do when you get these massive double page spreads, because of course, it's one thing to have Miller give you a full page, which is already wide enough, but when he opens the book completely, you're like, whoa, this is really a big book. It's really, it's a big piece of paper. And so you have to step back from these and look at the whole pattern, because he is fundamentally, in many ways, Miller is a phenomenologist. And the way I'm using that in this particular case means that he's trying to get the whole thing by looking at different pieces of it. Now, we've become much more comfortable with this kind of storytelling in the last, say, 40 years, really, with postmodernism, where we use distributed narratives. And that's what you are used to now with Tim O'Brien. That's a distributed narrative, where different people have different stories, and the narrator has a story. Okay, that is a distributed narrative. That's a postmodern narrative where you're trying to get at the thing by looking at all the different positions around it. Same thing is true with Slaughterhouse Five, which is fundamentally the same kind of narrative. It's just about basically 20 years before Tim O'Brien comes along. So it's not a surprise that the one which is more recent is going to make more sense to you. In this case, what we have to do is step back from pages 24 and 25 and look at, here are the men, piling down this hill and then going up into this fissure, basically, between the rocks. If we pull back, we can see that we have a figure ground relationship, which means that, and this is the same thing that surrealists often work with, where the thing doesn't seem to make sense until you pull back and you stop your eyes seeing the details and you see the relationship between the shadows and the ground that they are on. The ground, in this case, means that the figure ground relationship means what is the figure, like if you take this image at the moment that I'm making, I am supposed to be the figure, and the ground is supposed to be all the stuff behind me. This is the ground against which I am. It is when it's represented as, say, a painting or a piece of graphic work, the ground is literally the grounds. It is the tablet or whatever it is that you're painting on or drawing on. So that's the ground. The figure comes in front of the ground, right? Figure ground relationship. And so what Miller is going to do is cause our eye to exchange these two things. And this is really what a figure ground relationship is, that you have to go back and forth between the two things, and you're trying to see how is one part of the other. Okay, so you're like, what the heck is this about, Tim? It's like, have a look at this massive curve, because what we have is not just one curve, but then a second curve, right? If we pull back far enough, we see that we've got a dark and a light and a dark. This should start to sound familiar if you think about the East, right, in terms of Eastern forms of design. Specifically, it should look like this, which is the yin-yang symbol, where you've got the same, there's some of each in the other. This is the perfect balance. This is a symbol of perfect balance, right? Where not all blacks are not all black, whites are not all white. Basically, you can take this in a number of different ways, metaphorically, and so on. So Miller is doing the same kind of thing, and if you go back then and look at pages 24 and 25, you'll see, yes, I see. If we back up from this and I stop looking at the men and focusing on all the detail that Miller has poured into this, and I pull back, I see a dark curve on a light ground and a light curve and a dark ground. Okay, and it makes this one big S-shaped curve. Okay, that's what I'm after.